We hear it all the time, right? You hear it growing up. You hear it in school. You see it on TV. When you go to jury duty, what do we hear? Innocent until proven guilty. Well, after 3 decades, this is my 30th year at Dateline. After 3 decades of witnessing how this system operates from the front line, what I'm here to report back to you is that innocent until proven guilty is more of a marketing slogan for a system that too often treats truth and facts as optional and prioritizes finality and winning over accuracy. As of today, according to the National Registry of Exonerations, there have been 3,684 people who have been kidnapped by the government, that have been put in a cage, stolen from their lives, their families, their children, their parents. Think about that, the ripple effect of that. Some of them are in this room. To think about the horror of that is one thing, but here's what's haunting. That's not even a thimble in this ocean of injustice. Most experts believe that somewhere around 100,000 innocent people are in prison right now as we're sitting in this room. That is an epidemic. These are not rare mistakes. These are routine disasters masked as justice. Every time someone is exonerated, it's a legal victory and a vindication, but it's also something else. It's a miracle. And there's many miracles in this room, and one of them is my brother. We share the same mother. His name is J.J. Velazquez, who I visited at Sing Sing. I met him 23 years ago. I visited him more than 250 times over 20 years. Did a story, proved his innocence in 2012. He spent another decade in prison. Here's a guy whose innocence is obvious to anyone with any intellectual honesty and curiosity, with critical thinking skills. He met the former president of the United States, Joe Biden, apologized to him on behalf of society. He needed a letter from his parole officer to go to the White House to get that apology. He was in the movie Sing Sing. He went to the Oscars. I've never been there, but you know. He went to the Oscars. He has a book about him, podcast, docuseries, and guess what? He was only exonerated, his great name finally cleared only 9 months ago in September. So the question is if it takes that for a guy like this, think about everybody else who's not being heard. JJ, why don't you talk about your experience and what you see?
The first thing I would like to say is that in order for me to be standing on this stage, it wasn't done by any one person. It was done by a sea of people, and I see some of you in these seats. And I say that because if we're gonna stand here and talk about wrongful convictions on this stage with this team, then we need to recognize what's actually taking place, right? I have a friend who I see myself in him because he spent 23 years wrongfully convicted. His case was reversed. He's been home 2 years. He's done everything that we've asked him to do as a member of society. He has been working for a judge in New Rochelle, working for a diversion program, right? He's doing everything right, and his conviction that was vacated has now been reversed. And so if you can fathom this, this is what we're doing. We're sitting here talking about activating change. And I'm telling you that a wrongfully convicted man is about to go back to prison for 17 more years. And that's what we need to be talking about. Today is not to talk about JJ. Today is to talk about Andre Brown. Remember that name.
Is Andre here? Andre is right here. Andre has a loving wife. His son and his daughters just graduated. His daughter just graduated. His son is 14 years old, A+ student, basketball star. If they make him go back, his son's going to be 31 when he comes home.
He was supposed to turn himself in today while we're here celebrating.
He called me, and you know when he found out? He found out on Christmas Eve that they reinstated his conviction. What penological public safety reason does it make sense to send Andre Brown back to prison? His case is out of the Bronx. Don't worry, DA Gonzalez. Josh, you're a lawyer that deals with this all the time. Not from a legal perspective, but from an emotional perspective. What's it like to represent people like JJ and Andre and others? What kind of toll does it take on you to see what you see?
I think less about the toll it takes on me than seeing the human cost that these wrongful convictions leave in their wake. I'm a crier. I had been often told as a young kid that I was too sensitive, and I probably am. And it finally paid off, I think, because I'm an empath, and I often was told to not let that show. It wasn't manly, it wasn't macho, didn't have its place in a courtroom, and certainly not before a district attorney or a conviction integrity unit. And probably not great for my mental health, but I don't really care. If you don't get moved by these stories and you're not moved by the tragedy of, a wrongful allegation, let alone a wrongful conviction, and, as I said, the human cost that it leaves in its wake, then I don't think that you have any place doing this work.
Can you describe the frustration that you face when you know somebody is innocent fighting against the system? What kind of frustration is that for you?
I mean, I'm dealing with a case right now that anyone that'll listen, I'll tell, in Ohio, where we got the district attorney to agree to vacate the convictions. And, due to a lot of local political pressure, the incoming DA said, well, wait, shouldn't I have a chance to review it? And then undid everything when he came into office. I used to get real frustrated. I get energized now. And I think the more unfair it is just fuel for me. But listen, it's not just like pushing a boulder up a mountain. It's like pushing a civilization up a mountain. It's like, and it takes a big team effort to be able to do it. And I would encourage, the people that do this work, that try to keep their emotions in check, or making, whether it's a jury appeal, an appeal to a judge, an appellate court, conviction integrity unit. So the more you can humanize it by, allowing the emotional toll that your clients might be shouldering to somehow shine through in your advocacy, I think it makes a big difference. I learned as a young lawyer from watching Barry in court. Barry was a crier. And he was, and it was almost like empowering to watch that, and I feel like it has its place. I'm not saying to cry on cue or on purpose, but I'm sitting here in the front row getting emotional. I was listening to Kemba tell her story earlier about looking at someone that is paroled. Or gets probation, and understanding that they're not the person they were 3 decades ago. It's hard to get that across without getting emotional and sort of letting it bleed through. But look, this is a whole different panel discussion for another time. Frustration isn't the right word. You know, as a white man, I feel like it's almost my duty and obligation to try one grain of sand at a time to somehow try my best to undo the awful hypocrisy that this country was built on and that this criminal justice system has emanated from, and the financial inequality. So I have a lot of frustration. I just have to figure out a way to focus it.
Yeah, I think that's great. And this is a good little departure that I hate. When I say hate, I don't like using the word hate, but I do not like talking about innocence in a vacuum because it puts a focus on some other people who committed crimes. And the reality is we're all human beings. And to separate innocent people from guilty people, when you talk about parole and, you know, somebody who did something when they're 16, 17 is not the same when they're 50 years old, right? So the pathology and the irrationality really is that we need to fight. This is the next incarnation of the civil rights movement, is mass incarceration. And when the history books are written from 200 years from now, they're going to look back at this time, I believe, the way that we look with our disbelief and disgust at slavery. The tip of the spear, though, of course, is wrongful convictions. Obviously, nobody should be in prison if they're innocent. When the history books are written about this movement, Vanessa Potkin, her name is going to be just under Barry and Peters. Vanessa has probably saved more people's lives and is a hero to so many people. She's been with the Innocence Project. How many people have you helped free? Do you have anyway, a lot. From a league, she's incredible. She's an incredible human being. From a legal perspective, not an emotional perspective, why is it so hard to get a guy like JJ out? Why is it so hard for the Conviction Integrity Unit, maybe I should leave this for the DA, for the Conviction Integrity Unit with Andre's case, to see pretty clear evidence of innocence, and no one listens? Why is it so hard?
Well, I think that you called the presumption of innocence before trial a marketing ploy. Is that what you just said? Well, if you have that marketing ploy before trial, after trial, there's not even the appearance that that exists. All of the presumptions favor the conviction, and so you're presumed guilty. It is just extraordinarily hard to overturn a conviction, you know, because of procedural barriers that are built into the law to make it almost impossible to get back into court and overturn your conviction. That is why, you know, we have this huge discrepancy between potentially 100,000 innocent people in prison, and each year we're exonerating 150 people, which, you know, the media will say record numbers of people being exonerated, but it's not getting to the problem at all. And so, you know, some of those barriers, when we started this work earlier, Virginia, for example, had a rule that you had 21 days after your conviction to get back into court to present new evidence of innocence. I mean, that's just absurd. If you had it on day 20, you probably would have had it at trial. Some of those rules have been changed, but the law still doesn't really recognize the extent of wrongful convictions, and so it's built in a really biased way that thinks most people who are convicted are guilty. We're here today. We have also Jabbar Walker here with us, who Jabbar served, you know, over 2 decades in prison for a crime that he didn't commit, and part of the evidence against him was a witness who said that Jabbar admitted that he did the crime, and this person was pressured by police to give this false statement. And after trial, before sentencing, he came forward and said, "I lied." Nobody listened to him. So if anybody just would have stopped at that point and considered what he was saying, it took Jabbar like 15 years to get back into court and to file a pro se motion. So he was litigating on his own, because after your appellate process, you're not even entitled to a lawyer. So you're trying to fight by yourselves or whatever resources your family can put together. So it's just to be able to get back into court, to get a judge to order a hearing. I mean, it is, you're totally going against all odds. I'll say really briefly that also there are, we have to consider who are the decision makers, even when you can, who's hearing the case. We just had an instance in the Bronx where the conviction integrity unit agreed a conviction should be vacated, and a judge refused to vacate the conviction where there was a horrible eyewitness identification that was at the basis of that conviction. Today, somewhere out there, we have Nina Morrison, who's a federal judge who worked at the Innocence Project. She is the only person in the country who is a federal judge who has represented innocent people as, their primary work. So what is the perspective of the people who are making the rules? Mostly prosecutors who just are coming from a different perspective. You're not really getting a fair shake, and sometimes you're getting the prosecutor who worked in that office at the time the conviction was prosecuted. So, we have to, I go to the ballot box and I see judges there and I don't know who they are, but it's, we really have to make sure judges are elected in many places, that people who are in these positions are, going to do the right thing and going to just understand the scope of the problem. And there is, you talked about not separating innocent and guilty people. I mean, even the procedural obstacles to wanting to do the right thing in a case, like in New York, there's legislation for the Second Look Act so that prosecutors, the defense can move and try to get somebody resentenced when there's these excessive, exorbitant sentences. And, right now there's no mechanism necessarily to do that. So it's like we need to change the law to reflect the reality of what is going on. And finally, I'll just say that it is cultural, because we have to, we work with conviction integrity units, and we'll get into that in a little bit. And it is amazing the work that we can do when you're able to partner with the prosecutor's office and really go back and reinvestigate a case with the goal of getting to the truth. It's amazing. However, it's really hard when that small unit in the office is the unit that believes wrongful convictions exist. And if you're not with that unit, and there's a disconnect with the people who are handling the appeals, and their knee-jerk reaction is just to oppose all efforts at post-conviction relief, or for somebody to overturn their conviction. So we really need to do a lot of work on cultural change so that the scope of the problem, and we're changing people's perspectives on being willing to look at a case and not just read what's the first decision that makes somebody look really guilty, and we're going to stick to that narrative and those facts and never take a look at the witness who's coming forward and saying, I lied.
Just to show you that what Vanessa is saying happens in action, the prosecutor that undid everything in Ohio, his mentor was the man that prosecuted my client and the 3 other men. And I come to find out that he not only was his mentor, but that the new prosecutor was part of the appellate unit that denied them post-conviction relief, and they get back into office, and it wasn't about re-reviewing the case. It was just about, I'm not going to let my mentor's conviction of these men get flushed down the toilet, and it becomes a lot about winning instead of the truth.
If we can just turn the lights on for 1 second. If you were wrongfully convicted and in this room, can you stand up?
Let's go, stand up. I know a couple of y'all.
All of these men are part of those 3,684 people. So none of us would be here talking about innocence. In my phone, Barry Scheck is listed as the Godfather. I call him the Godfather every time I talk to him. You guys could sit down if you want. I call him the Godfather because it was Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld that created the Innocence Project and really informed America there's innocent people in prison. We all have a great deal of debt and personal gratitude I have, Barry, for you. And when the history...
Someday I will come and ask you a favor.
And when the history books of the Innocence Movement is written, obviously Barry's name is coming first. But Barry did something else. Less than 20 years ago, he was one of the architects of a thing called conviction integrity units, conviction review units. It was 2007, am I right? 2007 was it was actually, California was the first one, but in Dallas, Craig Watkins opened this conviction integrity unit, and the mere recognition of human fallibility, that sometimes prosecutors get it wrong, that in itself was a huge moment, that admission. Since then, there's something like 80-something conviction review units around the country now. Now, as one of the architects of that, and worked very closely with DA's office across the country, this is not a loaded question because of what happened to JJ with the conviction integrity unit in Manhattan under Cy Vance, that totally did not act in good faith. Sorry, I'm a truth teller. How do you think conviction integrities, how do you measure up right now how effective they are across the country?
Well, the growth of conviction integrity, the first one, as you point out, and everything is, often what happens in a political arena. Craig Watkins won a surprise election in Dallas. And if any of you have ever seen the great Errol Morris movie about famous wrongful conviction in Dallas, you'll know that that was a very tough place to exonerate anybody. So literally what happened is that Craig got in office. There was somebody named Mike Ware who was part of the Innocence project in Lubbock, Texas, and he became head of the conviction integrity unit. And literally the person that was doing intake at the Innocence project went down to Dallas, and we began looking at all the cases where there was DNA testing possible, where the previous administration had refused to do it, right? And so we got lots of exonerations, and it was actually a lab that had a lot of evidence that you could test. And we developed some really good practices there. And I say this not just because Eric Gonzalez is a friend, but the late Ken Thompson, I think, took another step forward here in Brooklyn when he established a conviction integrity unit, and Eric was the first assistant, and we negotiated ways of doing it. And it really arose from a case eventually from this one detective, Scarcella, who had engaged in bad practices, which led to wrongful convictions. And I don't know how many of you were here in the last panel when we talked about things that we can do in terms of bringing transparency to the system. And we have in the state of California, where every law enforcement officer has a license, as well as every correction officer. Each of them can be decertified from having that license if they commit one of 9 serious acts of misconduct. That applies to all of them. It's only fair to the officers. One rule governs everything. They all have what we call a unique identifier, because badge numbers are reusable, and you can use artificial intelligence tools to track people. That is a reform that we need here in New York. My point to you, Dan, about conviction integrity units is that it's no better than the communities that are looking at the prosecutors. For a conviction integrity unit to actually succeed, the elected must want to have innocent people get out of jail, and must trust the fact that when you let an innocent person out of jail and you conduct an investigation that can be embarrassing to people in the office, that your community is going to realize that you are doing something good. You are increasing public safety. You are bringing justice to your community. And I think that Ken believed it, and I think Eric believed it. Now, let me stop before you go any further about this.
You know where I'm going?
I know where you're going. But the point is that The Brooklyn unit had 10 people until Charlie Lenahan just left, and probably get close to that soon. That is a lot for a conviction integrity unit, and Charlie Lenahan was the last head of the conviction integrity unit in Brooklyn, said to me the other day, there's got to be at least 20. There are so many of these cases, and we are getting better and better at finding ways to exonerate people. It's not just DNA. We have all kinds of proof that we can use. And we have things like shaken baby syndrome, which is an international public health crisis because there was bad science that not only had led to wrongful convictions of the last caretaker of a child, but have broken up families and family courts all across the country. So more and more is going to happen. And believe it or not, when you have these artificial intelligence tools, when you get transparency in a system, when you can track what police officers have committed acts of misconduct, you find the innocent. We did a study of all the exonerees from the Registry of Exoneration in New York after we repealed 50A of the Civil Rights Act and began to find out which cops in New York had adjudicated acts of misconduct or unsubstantiated. And by outrageous orders of magnitude, the cops that had those problems were involved in wrongful convictions. It's not an accident.
So you mentioned some of the things that are working. You know this because you wrote a blurb for my book. That the unit that investigated JJ's case, the first conviction integrity unit in Manhattan, Alvin Bragg ran on a platform calling it a CRINO, conviction review in name only, because they didn't, with good faith and honesty, look at facts and look at evidence, and they doubled down on the conviction of an innocent man, and it caused him to spend another decade in prison. So the question is, you know, about not what is working, but when you have the fox watching the hen house, it's like the umpire who's making the call is also doing the instant replay. Isn't there a problem there?
Yes, but look, there have been a lot of conviction integrity units that were CRINOs, right? But it is not an easy job. Believe me, we've had people that were prominent in the Innocence movement who wound up becoming, like in New Orleans, right? Heads of conviction or human rights department in those places. It's hard. Sometimes people in the office look at you like you're internal affairs from the cops. These are old cases. They're hard to investigate. You are hampered by getting access, frankly, to information from the police department. That still remains a huge problem in this city and across this country. So, look, we're in a race against time to get all these innocent people out of prison. We know there are so many more than anybody ever imagined. We're getting better at it, and it's helpful when you have a conviction integrity unit that will do joint reinvestigations and give you work product, which they do in Brooklyn.
May I say one thing really quickly? Hopefully that Barry is okay with this. But the problem is that it is a discretionary process. The conviction integrity units are voluntarily undertaking the work. So it's not an equal relationship. The prosecutors and the conviction integrity unit hold all the cards. They can decide how much discovery they want to give you. They can decide if they want to give you work product or not. So you're kind of pleading, begging, prodding, hoping. So it is a great thing to be able to have a partner to review a case, but it's not it's not an equal relationship. You're not coming to the table with rights because it's completely discretionary that they're undertaking this review. So that does make it difficult.
Okay, DA Gonzalez. So I first met Eric Gonzalez many, many years ago when Ken Thompson started the Conviction Integrity Review Unit in Brooklyn. And Eric has always been an upfront, honest, decent human being who, in reality, as a truth teller, has one of the most robust conviction review units in the country. that operates in good faith. In fact, one of JJ's former attorneys that helped him get out of prison, she's here, Celia Gordon, works for Eric in the conviction review unit. And the good news, I told Eric today that the word Brooklyn doesn't show up in my book anywhere. But Eric, serious note, when we talk about these units and we talk about this discretionary process and these decisions that you need to make, you're a chief law enforcement officer. You're also a politician. So how do you weigh these decisions about whether or not to exonerate somebody?
You know, when I joined the DA's office, over 2 decades ago, I was living in East New York. I grew up in East New York and Brooklyn. And my reasons for joining the district attorney's office were different than a lot of DAs. I joined the office because I saw injustice in our criminal justice system, and I often wondered who's making the decisions for the people of East New York, for the people of Brooklyn. So I didn't join for the typical reasons that a lot of people join DA's offices. I want to fight crime. I want to, hold people accountable. I knew that was important in doing the work, but I also felt like somebody who had skin in the game, who lived in my neighborhood, lived in my community, should have decision-making authority. And I knew that would take some time. So I view the job differently, but also having those experiences of feeling over-policed, underserved, always weighed in my mind, and knowing people who've been through the justice system, people from my family, people from my community, knowing that people had been wrongfully convicted. I think Barry said it, and Dan said it, like the concept to many young prosecutors that people are wrongfully convicted seems foreign to them. That someone could falsely confess seems foreign to them. I think now the work of the Innocence Project, the work of these conviction integrity units, has allowed that conversation to take place. It's happening in law schools. But when I started this unit for Ken Thompson, I looked around the country. There was Dallas. There was not a conviction review unit that was formed that really did work outside of DNA. And what we hoped to do in Brooklyn was a more comprehensive unit, a unit that would take on reinvestigations where DNA was not possible, where there was not that kind of scientific evidence. So when I look at these cases, when they come to me, we wanted to establish something that was different in Brooklyn. And I think there's a couple factors that's different in Brooklyn than many other units. One is we have an internal conviction review unit, the 10 prosecutors who look at those cases for me. But we also have an external unit, a pro bono defense lawyers who look at this, who also make a recommendation. So there's also not just the internal recommendation, there's an external recommendation. And I think what we tried to do in Brooklyn, which is completely different than what existed before, was that this was going to be very transparent and collaborative, right? I think a lot of the impossibilities, it seems, of reversing decisions is because of this concept of finality. And so we looked at it different. We wanted it to be collaborative. We wanted it to be transparent. And so Brooklyn remains the only office in the country, as far as I know, that writes a full report on every exoneration we do. So when I look at these things, when these decisions come to me, it's not disbelief that this could happen. And in fact, I've met some of the exonerees from my office here today, earlier in the day. We've also exonerated people who've pled guilty. Very few offices do that, reinvestigate cases where there's an admission of guilt, which is very powerful typically in the courthouse. But we've understood, and I understood coming from East New York, that people actually have pled guilty, will plead guilty, because that's a way of resolving their jeopardy, and getting out from underneath an impossible system. So I think that is part of the difference of the office. I'm optimistic because it's less than a dozen years ago. When I looked around, I couldn't find anyone but Craig Watkins significantly doing the work. And I know that there are offices across the country now that have launched conviction review units. I think one of the things that we need is funding, because you heard my former chief, Charlie Linehan, said that we need more people to do the work. Well, I spend $2 million of my budget internally to do this work. I'm not funded for this. There's no funding from the city of New York or from the state of New York that specifically comes to my office to do conviction review. And that's a shame, because getting to the heart of what's fair and just and what's right is significant. And you would think that, with all the conversations around wrongful conviction, with all the money that we spend on policing, on our court system, that there would be, revenue streams to make sure that every district attorney's office had a robust and a well-functioning conviction review unit.
So, structurally, the way that the system is set up, how do you, with this playing field is completely uneven. You have tremendous power as a prosecutor. You have the NYPD as your investigative arm, and basically any budget you want to investigate a case if you need to. In JJ's case, his private investigator never even visited the crime scene. How do you deal, is that imbalance structurally, that unlevel playing field, is there a way to overcome that for people?
Well, the relationship between DA's offices and police departments vary from city to city, location to location. When it comes to doing conviction review, conviction integrity, I can't say that there's a lot of participation back from the New York City Police Department. We do that internally with our own investigators. So that is one of the problems in getting information from the police on a lot of these cases, getting evidence, finding old evidence, collecting it, testing it has been sometimes challenging, and it takes a lot of hard work just to get that level of participation. But what I think is important in Brooklyn is that it's meant to be collaborative, right? It's meant to look at this work together and share as much as we can share at any given time. The adversarial system, I think, is just problematic and has led to so many wrongful convictions. The one thing I can do as DA is that when I hire young prosecutors, right, we could teach them all the lessons of all the reasons why there's so many wrongful convictions. We issued a report with the Innocence Project looking at 25 wrongful convictions that came out of my office over 30 years. We can train them, but what we have to do is imbue them with the sense that their jobs as prosecutors is to keep an open mind, to think about the possibility of innocence, not to have biased confirmation, not just to do what the police say happened, to investigate the cases. That is the key to really preventing wrongful convictions. It is to make sure that prosecutors on the front end are thinking about getting it right, so that we're not just battling on the back end about, years later after all the harm's been caused. And I think that is something that my office is really trying to infuse in every young prosecutor. When they come into the office, they hear from our conviction review unit, they learn the lessons, and we just say to them, it's your responsibility not to secure convictions, but to do justice. And understanding this, and I visit prisons, right? You've seen me in prisons. If any of you have been in prison, you know I go to prisons. I say to them, everyone is my constituent as an elected official. it's not just victims and survivors of crimes that are my constituents. It's convicted people, and it's families of convicted people. And the obligation is to do the work fairly. And I think that is where it's lacking across the country, because you only hear prosecutors talk about representing survivors and victims of crime. They have to understand that they represent everyone.
You know, culturally, we know that culture really does exist, that, you know, that the people with great power, prosecutors within the system, subtly and not so subtly, are encouraged to act in ways that are irresponsible without them even realizing it, with confirmation bias and tunnel vision. Barry, before I turn it over to you, one more question for you. And I just want to step outside Innocence for a second, even though that's what this panel is about. Whenever you go out, I see you out here, you're mobbed by people, right? There's a lot of convictions out of your borough over the past 30 years, whatever. When people go away, when they're 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, young people who make mistakes, bad choices like we all do, and they're 30, then they're 40, and they're still in prison, and they've gotten education, and they've changed, and they're no longer a threat to public safety. There's a lot of people who want to reach out to you and say, I want you to reconsider my sentence. What do you say to them?
Well, we have a post-conviction justice bureau in Brooklyn, and we're the only office that I know in the state that has that, looking at issues of parole, clemency, resentencing, and I, support and have been working with the Innocence Project on a second chance bill. I think that's important, but I know, and one of the things that I did as DA is I asked the Department of Corrections to withdraw all of the letters from my office over the many, many years that said this person should die in prison, they should never be released early, they should stay out, that we have to reassess every case as someone is coming on behalf of the parole board. And so that's part of the process. Again, I also pay for reentry in my office. I'm the only district attorney to fund their reentry bureau by my funds. Again, no state funds are given to me to do reentry work. So to that point, when people are ready to be returned home, they need to be given that opportunity. And I do think that there's a possibility of getting legislation passed even this year.
This shouldn't be this should not be the exception, though.
Right.
This should be the rule. When we opened the Perlmutter Center for Legal Justice at Cardozo Law School, I got a lot of heat because my keynote speaker was Eric Gonzalez. And I thought that it was important that he would do it and that we would have you, because I think that, creating that dialogue for young attorneys to say, okay, if I become a prosecutor, I want to do it the right way. And here's an office that is literally the beacon of hope, not just in this city, but across this country. And we have many cases before the Brooklyn DA at my center, and we disagree. And sometimes, but one thing you always know is that you're going to get a substantive review, a real review.
So I just want to recognize DA Gonzalez. Coming into a place like this is not an easy thing for you to do, I'm sure. I appreciate you being here, and I know everybody else appreciates you being here too.
Thank you, Dan.
We're running out of time, so what I want to do is, did you want to say something else?
Yeah, I did want to say something else. You asked me before which units succeed and don't succeed.
Is it what?
The number one, which conviction integrity units succeed or don't succeed. Eric put his finger on it when he talked about the cognitive bias, right? Being able to do a joint reinvestigation, but most of all, it's the work product, right? District attorneys across this country and conviction integrity units say, I'm not going to show you my whole file. I'm not going to show you the work product, and the exculpatory evidence is always buried in the work product.
Right.
And that's what makes a difference. And I have to say one other thing, in fairness. Of course, Brooklyn was great doing those reports. Judge Nina Morrison, who's here today, helped write one of those reports. But Larry Krasner in Philadelphia did something that is quite amazing. Working with the Zimroth Center at NYU Law School, they published the names of everyone that was involved in wrongful convictions, including the district attorneys that worked on the cases and did full comprehensive reports.
Yeah, and Larry Krasner is amazing and under fire. Before we end, and I turn it over to Barry for one special presentation, I really want to recognize someone who is a hero. Maria Velazquez, JJ's mother. Can you stand up? Maria, stand up. Maria fought for her son every single day he was wrongfully convicted. JJ's two little boys, who were 3 years old and 5 weeks old when he was sent away, are 30 and 27 now. I met them when they were 8 and 5. They spent 5 days a week in school, and Maria took those boys one weekend day every weekend to know their father, and they know their father over a prison room visiting table thanks to Maria Velazquez.